At the engagement party that had everyone's attention, Preston knelt desperately on the floor, his entire body covered in festering sores, because he had just lied and claimed that I had poisoned him. I put my arm around Chloe, who was dressed in red, and looked down at him as I poured champagne over his head, sneering, "Go on, keep talking. Let's see how many more lies your life can withstand. Welcome to Apex System, an exciting story is about to begin." The deafening sound of bang, followed by the noise of steel being violently torn apart, still seemed to echo in my ears, while the scorched smell of tires scraping against the pavement seemed to linger in my nostrils. I jerked my eyes open and gasped for breath, cold sweat dripping from my forehead down my chin and onto the leather steering wheel of the silver Aston Martin. I wasn't dead. Just 10 minutes ago, I was still trapped in the wreckage of this severely mangled sports car, helplessly watching it hurtle down that damn winding road in Malibu and plunge straight into the rocks of the Pacific. In the last second before I lost consciousness, I knew who had done it. Preston Gallagher, my fake younger brother, whom my father kindly adopted, was gentle and refined on the surface, but a venomous snake behind my back. He cut my brake lines, stole my family inheritance, and even took Chloe, the girl I was supposed to protect for the rest of my life. He trampled over my corpse and took everything. I raised my trembling hand and glanced at the digital clock on the car's control panel. May 10, 2024, 8 a.m. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air of a California morning. I had actually been reborn, returning to 3 hours before the car accident. This time, to hell with brotherly love. I pulled out the car keys, pushed open the door, and strode toward the foyer of the Gallagher family mansion. The company was holding a board meeting this morning that would determine its future direction. In my previous life, I had been in such a hurry to get to the venue that I climbed into that death trap of a sports car without the slightest suspicion. As soon as I entered the lavish foyer, I heard a painfully affected wail worthy of a third-rate Hollywood actor. Preston was sprawled at the foot of the sweeping marble staircase, clutching his right leg tightly with both hands and writhing in agony. Our father, Richard Gallagher, was crouched beside him, his face filled with anxiety and heartbreak. "Dad, don't blame Wyatt. He was probably just in too much of a hurry to get to a meeting and accidentally pushed me down the stairs." Preston squeezed out fake tears, his voice sounding incredibly weak. "My right leg. Oh God, it feels like it's completely broken. I'm in so much pain I could die. There's no way I can go to the office today." As he spoke, he glanced over his father's shoulder and shot me an extremely provocative and smug look. In my previous life, he had used this clumsy ploy of pretending to be injured to waste my time and provoke me. Then, when I had angrily driven the sports car he had tampered with out of the garage, I had stepped straight into hell. Just as I clenched my fists and prepared to charge forward and punch that hypocritical face of his as hard as I had in my previous life, a cold, emotionless mechanical notification suddenly rang out in my mind, detecting the host's intense desire for revenge. The lie backlash system has been activated. Rule confirmed. From this moment onward, every lie spoken by the target, Preston, will be physically manifested with 100% accuracy in his body or reality. I stood frozen in place. A system? This sounded even more thrilling than winning $10 million in Las Vegas. I unclenched my fist, and an unmistakably malicious smile curved across my lips. I didn't argue. Instead, I folded my arms across my chest and casually leaned against the Roman column by the entrance, watching him like a monkey in a circus act. "Preston, are you sure your leg is broken? Why don't you describe to Dad in detail just how serious it is?" I said leisurely. Preston clearly hadn't expected me to be unusually calm today, but he assumed I was merely pretending to keep my composure. So he put even more effort into his performance, clutching the sleeve of my father's designer suit. He shouted through his tears, "It really is broken. Wyatt, how can you be so heartless? The bones in my lower leg are already broken in two. I might have to spend the rest of my life in a wheelchair." The moment he finished speaking, a dull, bone-chilling crack suddenly erupted in the silent hall. It sounded exactly like someone using a large hydraulic cutter to forcibly snap a thick solid wood baseball bat in half. Just a second ago, Preston had been putting on an Oscar-worthy performance, but his expression instantly froze from feigned agony into absolute pallor. Without any external force touching it, the lower part of his previously perfectly intact right leg suddenly bent sharply outward at an utterly inhuman angle. Folding into a perfect 90-degree angle, his sharp tibia pierced through the inside of his $5,000 custom-tailored trousers like a dagger. The ghastly white bone fragment was exposed to the air, slick with blood, as crimson blood instantly gushed out and stained the expensive imported Italian marble floor red. The air froze for a second. The next second, Preston let out a piercing scream worthy of the heroine in a horror movie. His eyes nearly bulged out of their sockets as he clutched the leg that had truly been severed in two, rolling frantically across the ground like a loach tossed into boiling water. His father, Richard, gasped in terror and collapsed onto the ground, completely dumbfounded and too frightened even to help him up. I kept both hands in my pockets, looking down at his miserable, half-dead state. To be honest, This life got off to an absolutely fantastic start. Condemning yourself with your own words. Preston. The real show has only just begun. The banquet hall was ablaze with light, and Swarovski crystal chandeliers illuminated everything as brightly as day. This was the Gallagher family's annual business appreciation dinner, and nearly every prominent figure from New York's political and business circles had shown up. A month had passed since the broken leg incident that morning. Preston's right lower leg was encased in a heavy cast, and he struggled to make his way through the hall on a pair of custom carbon fiber crutches, looking like a comical roly-poly toy. To this day, the doctors couldn't explain why the bones in the lower leg of someone lying perfectly still on the floor had suddenly suffered a comminuted fracture, and could only attribute it to some extremely rare stress-related bone disorder. Holding a glass of aged bourbon, I stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching coldly as he smiled obsequiously and exchanged pleasantries with the uninformed board members. Like a brightly plumed peacock, Chloe was wearing a black backless evening gown tonight, resembling a proud black swan as she chatted with several socialites by the buffet table not far away. Seeing her standing here unharmed, I finally felt the weight lift from my heart. In my previous life, Preston not only killed me but also ruined her reputation with all sorts of lies, even driving her to the brink of despair. In this life, I swore to make him repay everything he owed, with interest. Suddenly, a commotion arose in the center of the hall. Father, your 18th century sapphire pocket watch is missing. Preston deliberately raised his voice, his exaggerated tone making it clear that he wanted every guest in the room to hear. Everyone's attention was instantly drawn over. Father, Richard, paled and frantically searched the inside pocket of his tailcoat. The pocket watch was an heirloom passed down through several generations of the Gallagher family, worth more than $5 million. More importantly, it was the centerpiece of the evening's presentation to the board, intended to showcase the family's heritage. How could it have disappeared? I was still carrying it just moments ago. Father was sweating profusely with anxiety. Preston's cold, sinister eyes immediately swept across the crowd and locked onto me like a venomous snake. Leaning on his cane, he limped to the center of the hall and pointed at me, loudly declaring, "Everyone, this is a disgrace to the family. I hate to say this, but I personally saw Wyatt lingering beside Father just now. We all know that his investments recently failed and that he desperately needs money. Wyatt, how could you be so utterly shameless? You actually stole the family heirloom for money." As soon as he said this, the entire hall erupted. The socialites whispered among themselves, their eyes fixed on me with disdain and suspicion. That bastard really never changes. In my previous life, he used the same trick to ruin my reputation in front of everyone, paving the way for him to rise to power later. I calmly took a sip of whiskey, set down my glass, and walked to the center of the crowd with an easy stride. Preston, I'll give you one more chance. Are you sure you saw me steal the pocket watch with your own eyes? I stared into his eyes, my voice as calm as a stagnant pool. Preston was clearly made uneasy by my unusually composed demeanor, but he had already backed himself into a corner, and could only grit his teeth and keep up the act. Of course, I swear to God, I just saw Wyatt secretly slip that sapphire pocket watch into his own pocket with my own eyes. If I've said a single word of a lie, then the pocket watch is in my trouser pocket right now. To make himself more credible, he even stamped the floor with his unbroken leg and loudly swore. No sooner had he finished speaking, jingle, an exceptionally crisp metallic clink rang out abruptly in the silent hall, where one could hear a pin drop. Everyone instinctively turned toward the sound. An antique pocket watch set with a huge sapphire and emitting a glow fell, with uncanny precision, from the trouser pocket of Preston's uncasted left leg, rolled a long way across the gleaming marble floor, and finally came to a stop right in front of Father Richard's polished shoe. It was as though all the air had been sucked out of the room. The entire room fell deathly silent, every gaze fixed on Preston as though he were an idiot. The expression on Preston's face was more spectacular than if he had swallowed a live fly. His mouth hung wide open, his eyes nearly bulging from their sockets as he stared rigidly at the pocket watch that had inexplicably fallen from his own pocket. He had even forgotten that he was leaning on crutches and instinctively reached toward his pocket. This is impossible. Absolutely impossible. I didn't put it in there. I swear I didn't. Preston waved his hands frantically like a madman, babbling incoherently as he tried to defend himself. I stepped forward and gently nudged the pocket watch with the tip of my shoe before turning to look at Father. Dad, it seems that after Preston broke his leg, he also lost his mind. He stole something himself. Yet he still wants to falsely accuse someone in front of all of New York's upper class. I sneered and shook my head. With that level of intelligence, how is he supposed to manage the family business in the future? Father Richard's face had turned utterly livid. At the most important banquet of the evening, his adopted son had put on such a clumsy and humiliating frame-up in front of everyone. Enough, you ungrateful wretch! Richard pointed furiously at Preston's nose, his hand trembling with rage. Security! Take him away! Don't let him make a fool of himself here! Several burly security guards immediately stepped forward and dragged the struggling Preston outside. The expensive carbon fiber crutch he had been leaning on also fell to the floor, leaving him looking as wretched as a stray dog. Watching him being dragged away, I picked up a glass of champagne and raised it toward him from afar. This is only the beginning, my dear little brother. The spectacle at the dinner party turned Preston into the laughingstock of New York's upper society. His father confined him to the mansion, stripping him entirely of the right to attend any social functions. But that was far from enough. I knew Preston would never let this go. In my previous life, he had used a mask of feigned devotion to win Chloe's trust, even exploiting her family's resources to bring me down. Chloe was a pure and kind-hearted girl. Until the day she died, she never knew what kind of demon the man who constantly professed his love for her truly was. In this life, I would never allow the same thing to happen. On Friday afternoon, I pushed open the door of an exclusive private coffee club on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. Chloe was seated by the window, looking down at a proposal for an art exhibition. Sunlight spilled over her flaxen hair, making her as beautiful as an oil painting. "Do you mind if I sit down?" I walked over to her and pulled out a chair. Chloe looked up and, seeing me, a flicker of surprise crossed her eyes. Since that inexplicable argument a few months ago, we had never sat together as calmly as we were now. In my previous life, I had been too proud and too oblivious to see through Preston's scheme to drive a wedge between us. "Wyatt," she closed the proposal, her tone carrying a hint of detachment. "Is something wrong? I want you to hear something." Without wasting words, I placed a miniature voice recorder on the table and pressed the play button. A clear conversation came through the recorder. "That idiot Wyatt has already been kicked out of the game by me. Chloe? She's nothing more than a pawn I'm using to control the Henderson family. Once I gain control of the Gallagher family, I'll cast her aside like a worthless rag. How could a boring woman like her ever be worthy of me?" Preston's familiar, cold, and contemptuous voice sounded particularly grating in the quiet cafe. Chloe's face instantly turned deathly pale. She widened her eyes in disbelief and covered her mouth tightly, as if she had heard some terrible curse. When was this recorded?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yesterday. I bribed one of the bodyguards around him." I looked at her calmly, without the slightest evasiveness in my eyes. "Chloe, I know this is hard to accept, but I have to make you see his true colors." Just then, the cafe door was violently pushed open. Preston rushed in, leaning on his crutch and gasping for breath. He had obviously received a tip-off from the bodyguard and run out despite the confinement order. Seeing the voice recorder on the table and Chloe's deathly pale face, Preston immediately understood everything. The panic on his face flashed by, quickly replaced by an expression of deep anguish. "Chloe, don't listen to his nonsense." He limped over to the table and pointed at me as he loudly defended himself. "That recording is fake. Wyatt deliberately used AI to synthesize my voice and frame me because he's jealous of us." He turned to look at Chloe affectionately, even squeezing out a few tears. "Chloe, you know me. How could I possibly say something like that? My love for you is pure and unconditional. I swear, if that recording really is me speaking, then may my throat rot right now, leaving me unable to say another word for the rest of my life." His voice was loud, drawing the attention of the other patrons in the cafe. Everyone looked sympathetically at this devoted man who had been framed. I leaned back in my chair and couldn't help laughing out loud. That bastard really wouldn't give up until he hit a dead end. Making such a vicious oath was practically a provocation directed at the system. "Preston, are you sure you want to make that kind of oath?" I looked at him with an ambiguous smile. "Of course. My conscience is clear." To prove his innocence, he even patted his chest and shouted loudly. As soon as he finished speaking, Preston suddenly seemed to have his throat choked by someone, letting out a spine-chilling gurgle. He clutched his throat in agony, his eyes instantly filling with blood vessels as his eyeballs bulged out. Then, an intensely pungent stench emanated from his mouth, like a rat that had been rotting in a sewer for half a month. He opened his mouth wide, trying to call for help, but all that came from his throat was a faint hiss, like air leaking from a broken bellows. Under Chloe's horrified gaze, Preston suddenly vomited a mouthful of black pus and blood mixed with foul-smelling chunks of rotten flesh. His throat, which had originally appeared normal, rapidly ulcerated and festered at a visibly discernible speed. What's wrong with you?" Chloe sprang to her feet in terror and staggered back several steps, staring in horror at the terrifying scene before her. Preston pointed at his throat in sheer terror, then pointed at me, his eyes filled with despair and confusion. He tried to speak, but whenever he opened his mouth, nothing came out except more pus and blood, and that nauseating stench. He had truly become mute, and his throat continued to rot. I rose unhurriedly and walked over to him, covering my nose in disgust with a handkerchief. "Preston, it seems even God can't stand listening to your lies anymore." I stared at him coldly. "This rotting throat is the best punishment for you. Take your hypocrisy and stench with you, and get out of our sight." I turned to look at Chloe, who was still in a state of extreme shock. I reached out and gently took her trembling hand. "Chloe, in my previous life, I was blind and failed to see his true nature, and I neglected you too. But from now on, I will never let anyone hurt you again. I looked into her eyes and said earnestly. Chloe looked at Preston, who was still struggling in agony on the ground and vomiting blood, then looked back up at me. She took a deep breath, as if she had finally made up her mind, and tightly clasped my hand in return. Take me with you, Wyatt. I took her hand and walked out of the cafe without looking back, leaving Preston to keep rolling around on the floor amid everyone's horror and disgust, like a dead dog in a muddy ditch. Months passed. After receiving top-tier medical care costing millions of dollars, Preston barely managed to undergo vocal cord reconstruction surgery. Although he could speak again, his voice had become as unpleasant as sandpaper scraping against the surface. The cast had also been removed from his right leg, but he still walked with a slight limp. Despite suffering these bizarre physical attacks one after another, his ambition to seize power had not diminished in the slightest. With his father Richard's indulgence, he continued to serve as the company's chief strategy officer. Today was an extremely important quarterly executive meeting for the Gallagher Group. The conference room was packed with board members and top Wall Street investors. We were discussing an overseas acquisition worth $200 million. I sat on the right side of the long conference table, watching Preston stride confidently toward the projection screen, leaning on his crutch. Today, he was wearing an outrageously flashy custom-made silver suit, as if he had already forgotten the painful lessons of the past few times. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I have an even more perfect proposal for this acquisition. In his grating, gong-like voice, Preston pointed at the complicated financial model on the screen and launched into his performance. Speaking at length, he tried to flaunt his expertise with a pile of highly obscure financial jargon, even displaying on the PowerPoint a hedge fund operating model that he claimed to have designed himself. As everyone knows, Preston smugly surveyed the conference room, deliberately pausing when his gaze reached my face. Before my father brought me back into the family, I graduated from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania with outstanding results on a full scholarship. During my years on Wall Street, I was hailed as a once-in-a-century financial genius, having created the miracle of a 300% monthly return. So please trust my judgment, this proposal is absolutely foolproof. Listening to his shameless boasting, I could barely keep from spitting out the coffee in my hand. The Wharton School? A financial genius? That bastard didn't even graduate from a community college. In my previous life, if his father hadn't paved the way with money, he wouldn't even have been qualified to set foot in the group's headquarters. The proposal he was presenting now was almost certainly something he had bought from some unfortunate Wall Street analyst. I set down my coffee cup and leaned back in my chair with interest. Preston, since you're a financial genius from Wall Street, can you explain how the risk premium for asset securitization is calculated in this model? Asked the representative of the investment company sitting across from him, an elderly man wearing gold-rimmed glasses. His brow furrowed. Preston smiled with complete confidence, just about to speak. At that very moment, the system's punishment arrived as promised. I clearly saw Preston's eyes become utterly vacant in an instant. His chin, which had been slightly raised, drooped limply, his mouth hung half open, and a glistening thread of saliva slipped from the corner of his lips and dripped onto his expensive silver suit. Abba. Preston made several meaningless sounds like an idiot. He stared blankly at the sharply dressed people in the conference room, his eyes brimming with clear, unmistakable stupidity. The conference room instantly fell deathly silent. Everyone stared in astonishment at the financial genius, who had been speaking eloquently just moments earlier, unable to understand how he had suddenly ended up like this. Preston? His father, Richard, furrowed his brow and shouted sternly, "What the hell are you doing? Answer Mr. Smith's question." Upon hearing his father's voice, Preston turned his head and began to grin foolishly, like a 3-year-old child. Hee, Big Apple. I want to eat a Big Apple, he mumbled, drooling as he scribbled all over the projection screen, turning the originally meticulous financial model into a complete mess. Mr. Smith, the investor who had asked the question, turned livid and abruptly rose to his feet. "Richard, are you making a fool of us? You brought an idiot who can't even speak coherently to explain a $200 million acquisition to us?" "No, Mr. Smith. Please let me explain." Richard panicked and hurriedly stood up, trying to salvage the situation while desperately signaling to the assistant beside him. I stood up, walked over to Preston, picked up a marker from the table, and wrote an extremely simple line of numbers on the whiteboard. 1 + 1 equals? I turned to the still grinning Preston. "Come on, financial genius. Tell everyone the answer." Preston stared at the numbers on the whiteboard, tilting his head as he thought for a long while. Then he shouted excitedly, 3! It equals 3! Boom! The conference room immediately erupted in an uncontrollable burst of muffled laughter. The directors, who were usually so stern and humorless, were now looking at Preston as though he were a clown in a circus. A financial genius who claimed to have graduated from the Wharton School and achieved the miracle of a 300% return didn't even know what 1 + 1 equaled. Mr. Smith trembled with rage, grabbed the documents from the table, and slammed them onto the floor. "This is absolutely ridiculous. If the Gallagher Group is led by someone like him, I'm withdrawing all my investments immediately. With that, he angrily slammed the door and stormed out. Several other investors shook their heads and followed him out of the conference room. An extremely important quarterly executive meeting had thus turned into an epic disaster. Richard was so furious, he nearly passed out. As he stared despairingly at Preston, who was still drooling and grinning foolishly, he completely broke down. Drag this humiliating idiot out of here. Put him in a hospital. And without my permission, he isn't to set foot outside his room, Richard roared, looking as though he had aged 10 years in an instant. I watched Preston being dragged out by security guards like a dead dog, without a trace of pity. When you try to wrap yourself in lies, you should be prepared for those lies to come back and bite you. With your IQ, the only place you're fit to play with mud now is a psychiatric hospital. Preston spent a full 3 months in the psychiatric hospital before miraculously regaining his intelligence. Of course, the doctor still had no idea what had happened and could only call it temporary dissociative stupor caused by stress. Having regained his freedom, he was like a starving mad dog, even more determined to tear and bite at everything in his path. Knowing that his reputation in the company was already in tatters, he turned his poisonous hand toward his father. It was a late night in November, and cold sleet was falling over New York. I received a call from the butler saying that father had suddenly collapsed in his study and had already been taken to the best private hospital in Manhattan. When I arrived at the VIP suite on the top floor of the hospital, Preston was already there. He was wearing a black overcoat, a look of devastating grief on his face, and was weeping inconsolably to several key directors who had rushed over. The doctor says, father suffered a severe cerebral hemorrhage and is now in a deep coma. He may never wake up. Preston covered his face, his hoarse voice echoing through the quiet corridor. Before falling into the coma, father signed this special power of attorney, giving me all proxy authority and supreme decision-making power over the group. He pulled a document from his briefcase and handed it to Williams, the eldest director. I stood not far away, watching his clumsy performance with a cold sneer in my heart. Father had always been in excellent health, and his checkup report from last week showed that all his indicators were perfectly normal. This so-called cerebral hemorrhage was undoubtedly a colossal lie Preston had fabricated to seize power, and that authorization letter had to be forged as well. Williams put on his reading glasses and carefully examined the document, his brow furrowing. This signature does indeed look like Richard's handwriting, but Wyatt is the first in line to inherit. Uncle Williams, you've seen it yourself. Wyatt has spent all this time doing nothing but dating and doesn't care in the slightest about the company's survival. Preston immediately turned his accusations toward me. Father had become completely disappointed in him, which is why he made this difficult decision in his final moments. I swear, everything I've said is true. If I've told even one lie, may I drop dead in this very hallway, to convince these old foxes. He once again made a reckless oath. I sighed. Preston, you really never learn, do you? The moment he finished speaking, a violent fit of coughing erupted from deep in his throat. Cough, 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 cough. Preston suddenly doubled over, clutching his chest in agony with both hands. The next instant, a fountain of scarlet blood gushed from his mouth. Blood splattered across the white wall, creating a horrifying sight. Preston's already pale face instantly drained of all color. He opened his eyes wide in terror and tried to cover his mouth with his hand. But the blood surged endlessly through the gaps between his fingers like floodwaters bursting through a broken levee. My God! Preston, what's happening to you? William stumbled backward in fright, and the forged authorization letter in his hand fell to the floor, stained with glaring red blood. The other directors also scattered in terror, afraid of being caught up in this bizarre scene. Preston's body convulsed violently. He pointed at me, his eyes filled with endless fear and despair. He wanted to speak, but as soon as he opened his mouth, another large gush of blood erupted, instantly turning the floor in front of him into a sea of blood. Just then, the hospital room door suddenly opened. My father, Richard, who had originally been in a deep coma and would never wake up, stood in the doorway with an ashen face. Although he looked somewhat weak, his gaze was exceptionally sharp. Preston, you bastard! Richard pointed at Preston, who was struggling in the pool of blood, his voice trembling with rage. Just now in the hospital room, the attending physician had already told him that he had merely suffered temporary shock from taking a rare sleeping pill. It was definitely not a cerebral hemorrhage. And Preston was the only person who could have slipped that drug into his bedtime milk. Father had heard Preston's malicious lie outside the door, cursing him and saying he would never wake up. Dad, I'm just glad you're all right. I stepped forward and supported the unsteady Richard. Richard looked at the authorization document on the floor, then at Preston, who was still coughing up blood, and a trace of resolve flashed in his eyes. Williams, ladies and gentlemen of the board. Richard took a deep breath and announced loudly, as of today, I am officially handing over the position of president and CEO of the Gallagher Group to my biological son, Wyatt Gallagher. As for Preston, call the police immediately and hand him over to them on suspicion of attempted murder and corporate fraud. When Preston heard this, his body jerked violently. He closed his eyes in despair and then completely passed out from severe blood loss and sheer terror. I looked down at him from above, the corners of my mouth curling into a cold smile. What belonged to me, I had finally taken back with my own hands. The days after I took over the Gallagher Group were as dazzling as the California sunshine. The company's stock price soared under my iron-fisted reforms, and Chloe officially moved into my private villa on Malibu Beach. Everything was unfolding according to the most perfect script, except for one dead rat struggling to survive in the sewers. Preston posted a staggering $2 million bail and was released on the grounds that he required urgent medical treatment. He now faces a sentence of up to 30 years, and all his personal assets have been frozen by the court. The fake heir who once lorded it over Wall Street's socialite circles was now reduced to a withered shell of a body, ravaged by incessant vomiting of blood. I knew that a mad dog driven into a corner would do everything in its power to bite back before it died. Late one Friday night in December, a dense fog blanketed Malibu Beach, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks seemed especially dull in the darkness. I was holding a glass of single malt scotch, seated in the surveillance room on the third floor of the villa. Just 5 minutes earlier, the estate's top-of-the-line thermal imaging security system had issued a silent alarm. I stared at the enormous 8K high-definition surveillance screen, unable to suppress a trace of icy mockery at the corners of my mouth. On the screen, a thin figure wearing a black hoodie and a mask was silently infiltrating my underground garage filled with supercars. Like a practiced burglar, he walked straight toward the silver Aston Martin, skillfully crawled underneath it, and pulled out a pair of heavy-duty hydraulic bolt cutters. It was the same model of car I had been driving when I died in my previous life. Preston, you really are an unimaginative loser. You're actually trying to use the same trick on me twice. Boss, do you want me to take a team down there and deal with him? Asked the security chief standing behind me, a former Navy SEAL. Lowering his voice, I shook my head, gently swirling the ice cubes in my glass. No, let him cut it. I stared coldly at Preston's shoulders, trembling slightly with exertion on the screen. If we catch him now, he'll get, at most, a charge for damaging private property. I want him to buy himself a one-way ticket to hell. About 10 minutes later, Preston crawled out from beneath the car. He cast a venomous glance at the Aston Martin, then slipped out of the estate the way he had come, like a ghost. I pulled up the surveillance footage outside the estate and saw him climb into a rented black Porsche sports car. He parked it at a secluded intersection a kilometer away. He was waiting for me to drive that sports car. Its brake lines cut toward my death just as I had in my previous life. Activate the autonomous driving test program for the Aston Martin. I set down my wineglass and issued the order to the head of security. The technology lab under the Gallagher Group was developing one of the most advanced autonomous driving systems in the world, and this Aston Martin was one of the test vehicles. A few seconds later, the silver steel beast let out a low growl, with no one behind the wheel. It glided smoothly out of the garage, slipping like a ghost into Malibu's thick night fog and heading toward the Pacific Coast Highway. I grabbed my car keys, hurried into the garage, climbed into a black, bulletproof Range Rover, and followed them from a distance. I didn't just follow them, I also had the head of security hacked directly into the onboard Bluetooth system of Preston's Porsche. I could now hear everything happening inside his car with perfect clarity. The Pacific Coast Highway, a winding mountain road with cliffs on one side and the Pacific Ocean on the other, resembled a colossal serpent snaking through the night fog toward the underworld. The silver Aston Martin cruised steadily ahead at 80 miles per hour. Several hundred meters behind it was Preston's black Porsche, and I drove the Range Rover, trailing behind like a ghost. Preston's heavy, nervous breathing came through the car speakers. Immediately afterward came the sounds of him dialing 911. 911 emergency dispatch. How may I help you? The dispatcher's voice rang out. Preston instantly switched to an extremely frightened and frantic tone, his rasping voice sounding especially shrill in the darkness. Help, officer. Send someone to Dead Man's Curve on the Pacific Coast Highway. It's my brother, Wyatt Gallagher. He's gone crazy. Preston shouted hysterically into the phone, lies pouring from his mouth like venom. Not only is he driving drunk, he's completely lost his mind. He's driving a silver Aston Martin at over 150 miles per hour. He's totally out of control. He's trying to get himself killed. He's about to speed off the cliff and take himself out. Send someone over here. Now. Amid this intensely realistic cry for help, he even slammed his foot down on the accelerator to make the Porsche's engine roar loudly, providing background noise to make it more convincing. He wanted to perfectly fabricate the testimony of an eyewitness. On this fog-shrouded cliff road with no surveillance cameras, once Wyatt plunged over the edge and was smashed to a pulp along with the car. This would be the perfect evidence to close the case. I gripped the steering wheel, listening to his malicious lies over the phone as he cursed me for speeding out of control and plunging off a cliff. In my mind, the system's cold, mechanical notification sounded right on schedule. Fatal lie detected. The target claims that the host is speeding recklessly out of control and plunging off a cliff. System determination. causality reversal. All physical states and the ultimate outcome described by this lie will immediately and with 100% certainty come to pass upon the target. The show was about to begin. The instant the system's cold notification ended, an ear-piercing roar of an engine suddenly erupted from the dense fog ahead. That wasn't the sound of an Aston Martin. It was the black Porsche driven by Preston, through the car's monitoring system. I could clearly hear Preston vividly describing to the 911 operator how I had lost control 1 second, only for his voice to turn into an extremely terrified scream the next. What's going on? Damn it, why is the accelerator stuck? Within just a few seconds, Preston's speed soared from a normal 60 miles per hour to an incredibly furious 150 miles per hour. Like a rocket being launched. This was the suicidal speed he had assigned to me in his lies. The Porsche tore down the wet, winding mountain road like a completely deranged black beast. Brake. Damn it, the brakes have failed. Preston's desperate howl rang through the car's speakers, accompanied by the teeth-grinding clanging of him stomping frantically on the brake pedal. This was the most extreme form of lies turning back on the liar. The system not only made him experience the terror of losing control at high speed, but also considerately replicated his act of cutting my brake lines with hydraulic shears, directly wiping out the braking capability of his Porsche. Ahead lay the Pacific Coast Highway's most notorious deadly bend, a nearly 90-degree hairpin turn perched on a cliff. In my previous life, it was here that I desperately stomped on an empty brake pedal, plunging into the abyss with my car. Tonight, it was his turn. No! No! Stop! Stop! Preston's piercing screams erupted from the speakers. He even desperately tried to pull the electronic handbrake, but it was already too late. At a speed of 150 miles per hour, no physical force could bring a runaway sports car to a stop before a sharp 90-degree bend. I was driving the Land Rover, stopped a few dozen meters before the deadly bend. Through the windshield, I watched the utterly horrific scene ahead with indifference. The black Porsche was like a cannonball fired from a gun, showing no sign of slowing as it shot straight toward the fragile steel guardrail at the edge of the bend. Bang boom! The tremendous impact echoed along the empty cliffside, deafening. In the face of the Porsche's violent momentum, the thick steel guardrail was no more substantial than paper, torn apart in an instant. The Porsche carved an eerily dark arc through the air, its headlights spinning wildly in the dense fog before plunging straight toward the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of feet below, where razor-sharp reefs awaited. The fall lasted a full 4 or 5 seconds. Boom! A thunderous, utterly muffled roar rose from the foot of the cliff. Then, beneath the dense fog, a gigantic orange-red fireball suddenly surged upward, illuminating the pitch-black waters. The sound of waves crashing against the reefs was instantly drowned out by the violent explosion. The moment the Porsche struck the rocks, its fuel tank exploded completely, and the entire car turned into a blazing mass of scrap metal. All that remained in the surveillance system was the dead silence of static crackling through the line. Preston, the devil who had taken everything from me and killed me once, had finally, on this freezing winter night, at the same cliff and in the same despair, been burned to ashes by his own lies. I lowered the car window, and the cold wind tinged with the smell of the sea blew against my face, making me feel more clear-headed than ever before. A little over 10 minutes later, the piercing sound of sirens approached from the distance. Several Los Angeles Police Department patrol cars and fire engines, their red and blue lights flashing, came to a stop in front of the guardrail that had been smashed through. I pushed open the car door and walked over with an utterly unhurried stride. "Mr. Gallagher? What are you doing here?" A police inspector leading the team recognized me and immediately jogged over. The Gallagher family's influence in Los Angeles's political and law enforcement circles meant he had no choice but to treat me with the utmost respect. I received an alert from the security system saying that someone was following the self-driving car being used for testing, so I came over to take a look. I pointed to the unharmed Aston Martin parked not far away, then looked at the ball of fire still burning below the cliff. My voice remained utterly impassive. "Looks like the follower had a bit of an accident." The police inspector leaned over to look at the horrific scene below the cliff and drew in a sharp breath. "Oh my God! At that speed, and with the explosion on top of it, there's no way anyone in the car could have been left with even a scrap of bone." The inspector shook his head. "The 911 dispatch center just received an emergency call. The caller claimed to have seen your car lose control and plunge off the cliff. As it turns out, the caller himself. Perhaps he hallucinated in the dense fog and mistook his own car for mine." I interrupted him calmly, a barely perceptible cold smile curling at the corner of my lips. How could the police possibly uncover the truth? The Aston Martin with its brake lines cut had only Preston's fingerprints on it, and the Porsche he had been driving bore all the hallmarks of an accident caused by extreme speeding and loss of control, sending it over the cliff. It would be an absolutely perfect accident, one that belonged entirely to Preston. I turned around and walked toward my Range Rover. The system's cold, mechanical voice never sounded again, but I knew that my revenge had finally come to a complete end. Goodbye, my lying little brother. The fire in hell should be warmer than the flames beneath this cliff. Shouldn't it? 3 days later, The horrific car crash on the Pacific Coast Highway was officially closed by the Los Angeles Police Department. Everything was as perfect as I had anticipated. The police found the hydraulic cutters bearing Preston's fingerprints in the garage of my estate, along with the tampered brake lines from the Aston Martin. The forensic team extracted DNA from the charred remains at the bottom of the cliff, confirming the victim's identity. The official conclusion was that Preston Gallagher suffered a complete mental breakdown under the dual blows of facing felony charges and being disowned by his family. He attempted to sabotage my vehicle's brake lines in order to murder me, but in a state of extreme delirium and hallucination. He mistakenly took the Porsche he was driving for my car. He ultimately lost control and plunged off a cliff while speeding away, bringing about his own demise. It was truly an excellent script, filled with dark humor, yet logically airtight. After learning the news, my father, Richard, seemed to have all his vitality drained overnight. He finally saw clearly what kind of twisted demon lay hidden within the good son he had raised for 20 years. After attending the extremely low-key funeral, my father officially stepped down as chairman of the Gallagher Group and, carrying his guilt and exhaustion with him, secluded himself at a country estate in the Hamptons, never again involving himself in the affairs of the business world. From that moment on, the Gallagher family completely became my empire alone. Time passed, and 3 years later, New York, Midtown Manhattan, the top-floor circular ballroom on the 99th floor of the Gallagher Tower. Tonight is the global celebration of the Gallagher Group's 70th anniversary. Wall Street's most powerful investment tycoons, Silicon Valley's rising tech magnates, and even high-ranking political officials have all gathered here. Every person's gaze toward me is filled with undisguised awe and ingratiation. Over the past 3 years, I not only used an iron fist to purge every malignancy within the company that had been beholden to Preston, but also expanded the family business empire on an unprecedented scale with sweeping reforms. Starting from traditional finance and real estate, we surged forward and came to dominate the global markets for new energy and cutting-edge autonomous driving technology. The Gallagher Group of today has seen its market value quintuple, becoming a veritable commercial empire whose edge no one dares challenge. Wyatt, congratulations. Your speech tonight was truly outstanding. A soft and elegant voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned around, and my gaze instantly grew infinitely tender as I looked at Chloe walking toward me. She wore a couture, starry sky blue evening gown by a top designer, with the sapphire heirloom necklace that Preston had once used to frame me around her neck. Chloe was no longer the innocent girl she had been back then, so easily blinded by lies. She was now the chairwoman of New York's most influential contemporary art foundation, and, more importantly, my irreplaceable soulmate. Without your support behind the scenes, Madam Chairwoman, my speech wouldn't have carried nearly as much authority. I smiled as I approached her, naturally slipping an arm around her slender waist and planting a gentle kiss on her forehead. The guests in the banquet hall cast envious glances our way. Throughout New York's upper society, we were recognized as the perfect, flawless architects of power. No betrayal, no lies, only absolute trust and the unspoken understanding of two people fighting side by side. Late at night, the noise faded away. I took Chloe's hand and rode the private elevator to the panoramic glass-domed office on the top floor of the building. The glittering nightscape of all Manhattan was like a dazzling river of stars spread beneath our feet, shimmering with the captivating glow that represented wealth and power. I poured 2 glasses of champagne, handed one to Chloe, and then walked over to the enormous floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city beneath my feet. What are you thinking about? Chloe gently embraced me from behind, resting her face against my back. I'm thinking about a dream from a long time ago. I gazed at the golden bubbles continuously rising in my glass and said softly, in that dream, I lost everything, my family, you, and even my life, crushed beneath steel on a cold highway. But fortunately, I woke up. Chloe moved in front of me, reached out her soft fingers, and gently smoothed my slightly furrowed brow. Her beautiful eyes were filled with determination and deep affection. That was only a nightmare, Wyatt. Now we have each other, and we possess the most unbreakable thing in the world. No one can hurt you again, and no lie can ever tear us apart. I looked at her, tilted my head back, and drained the champagne from my glass. Yes, no lie could ever hurt me again. Ever since Preston was reduced to ashes, the lies backfire system that had accompanied my rebirth has never made a sound again. Perhaps it detected that I had grown strong enough to need no protection from outside forces, or perhaps, at the pinnacle of power I had built with my own hands, there was no longer a fool who dared tell even half a lie to Wyatt Gallagher. I not only severed the fate of my previous life but also reshaped my own rules in this cruel world. You're right, Chloe. I set down my wineglass, pulled her tightly into my arms, and gazed down at the neon lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the symbol of absolute power. The nightmare is over, and our era has only just begun. Beneath New York's dazzling night sky, I sat firmly upon this throne, symbolizing the pinnacle of business. In this life, I won it all. The end.